Chapter 2, Essie. The smell was unbearable. In the corner, a woman was crying so hard that it seemed her bones would break from her convulsions. This was what they wanted. The baby had messed itself, and Effia, its mother, had no milk. She was naked, save the small scrap of fabric the traders had given her to wipe her nipples when they leaked. But they had miscalculated. No food for mother meant no food for baby. The baby would cry soon, but the sound would be absorbed by the mud walls, subsumed into the cries of the hundreds of women who surrounded it. Essie had been in the women's dungeon of the Cape Coast Castle for 2 weeks. She spent her 15th birthday there. On her 14th birthday, she was in the heart of Ashanti land, in her father's, big man's, compound. He was the best warrior in the village, so everyone had come to pay their respects to the daughter who grew more beautiful with each passing day. Quasi Nuro brought 60 yams, more yams than any other suitor had ever brought before. Essie would have married him in the summer, when the sun stretched long and high, when the palm trees could be tapped for wine, climbed by the spryest children, their arms holding the trunk in a hug as they shimmied to the top to pluck the fruits that waited there. When she wanted to forget the castle, she thought of these things, but she did not expect joy. Hell was a place of remembering. Each beautiful moment passed through the mind's eye until it fell to the ground like a rotten mango, perfectly useless, uselessly perfect. A soldier came into the dungeon and began to speak. He had to hold his nose to keep from vomiting. The women did not understand him. His voice didn't seem angry, but they had learned to back away at the sight of that uniform, that skin the color of coconut meat. The soldier repeated himself, louder this time, as though volume would coax understanding. Irritated, he ventured further into the room. He stepped in feces and cursed. He plucked the baby from Effia's cradled arms, and Effia began to cry. He slapped her, and she stopped, a learned reflex. Tansy sat next to Essie. The two had made the journey to the castle together. Now that they weren't walking constantly or speaking in hushed tones, Essie had time to get to know her journey friend. Tansy was a hardy and ugly woman, barely turned 16. She was thick, her body built on a solid foundation. Essie hoped and dared not hope that they would be allowed to stay together even longer. "Where are they taking the baby?" Essie asked. Tansy spit onto the clay floor and swirled the spittle with her finger, creating a salve. "They will kill it, I'm sure," she said. The baby was conceived before Effia's marriage ceremony. As punishment, the village chief had sold her to the traders. Effia had told Essie this when she first came into the dungeon, when she was still certain that a mistake had been made, that her parents would return for her. Now, hearing Tansy speak, Effia resumed her crying, but it was as though no one heard. These tears were a matter of routine. They came for all of the women. They dropped until the clay below them turned to mud. At night, Essie dreamed that if they all cried in unison, the mud would turn to river and they could be washed away into the Atlantic. "Tansy, tell me a story, please," Essie begged. But then they were interrupted again. The soldiers came in with the same mushy porridge that had been fed to them in the Fanti village where Essie was held. Essie had learned to swallow it down without gagging. It was the only food they ever received, and their stomachs were empty more days than full. The porridge passed right through her, it seemed. The ground was littered with their waste, the unbearable smell. "Ah, you're too old for stories, my sister," Tansy said once the soldiers left. But Essie knew she would give in soon. Tansy enjoyed the sound of her own voice. She pulled Essie's head into her lap and began playing with her hair, pulling at the strands that had been caked with dust, so brittle that they could be broken. Each one snapped like a twig. "Do you know the story of the Kenti cloth?" Tansy asked. Essie had heard it numerous times before, twice from Tansy herself, but she shook her head, asking if the story had been heard before was a part of the story itself. Tansy began to tell her 2 Ashanti men went out into the forest one day. They were weavers by trade, and they had gone out to hunt for meat. When they got to the forest to collect their traps, they were met by Anansi, the mischievous spider. He was spinning a magnificent web. They watched him, studied him, and soon realized that a spider's web is a unique and beautiful thing, and that a spider's technique is flawless. They went home and decided to weave cloth the way Anansi weaves his web. From that, Kenti was born. You are a fine storyteller, Essie said. Tansy laughed and smoothed the salve she had created onto her knees and elbows to soothe the cracked skin there. The last story she had told Essie was of how she had been captured by the Northerners, plucked from her marriage bed, while her husband was off fighting a war. She had been taken with a few other girls, but the rest had not survived. By morning, Effia had died. Her skin was purple and blue, and Essie knew that she had held her breath until Naomi took her. They would all be punished for this. The soldiers came in, though Essie was no longer able to tell what time. The mud walls of the dungeon made all time equal. There was no sunlight. Darkness was day and night, and everything in between. Sometimes there were so many bodies stacked into the women's dungeon that they all had to lie, stomach down, so that women could be stacked on top of them. It was one of those days. Essie was kicked to the ground by one of the soldiers, his foot at the base of her neck, so that she couldn't turn her head to breathe anything but the dust and detritus from the ground. The new women were brought in, and some were wailing so hard that the soldiers smacked them unconscious. They were piled on top of the other women, their bodies dead weight. When the smacked ones came to, there were no more tears. Essie could feel the woman on top of her peeing. Urine traveled between both of their legs. Essie learned to split her life into before the castle and now. Before the castle, she was the daughter of Big Man and his third wife, Mame. Now she was dust. Before the castle, she was the prettiest girl in the village. Now she was thin air. Essie was born in a small village in the heart of the Ashanti nation. Big Man had thrown an outdooring feast that lasted 4 nights. 5 goats were slaughtered and boiled until their tough skins turned tender. It was rumored that Mame did not stop crying or praising Naomi for the entire duration of the ceremony, nor would she set baby Essie down. You never know what could happen, she kept repeating. At that time, Big Man was known only as Kwame Asari. Essie's father was not a chief, but he commanded just as much respect, for he was the best warrior the Ashanti nation had ever seen, and at age 25, he already had 5 wives and 10 children. Everyone in the village knew his seed was strong. His sons, still toddlers and young children, were already tough wrestlers, and his daughters were beauties. Essie grew up in bliss. The villagers called her ripe mango because she was just on the right side of spoiled, still sweet. There was nothing her parents would refuse her. Even her strong warrior of a father had been known to carry her through the village at night when she couldn't sleep. Essie would hold the tip of his finger, to her as thick as a branch, as she toddled past the huts that made up each compound. Her village was small but growing steadily. In the first year of their walks, it wouldn't take but 20 minutes to reach the forest edge that cut them off from the rest of Ashanti land. But that forest had been pushed farther and farther back until by the 5th year, the journey there took nearly an hour. Essie loved walking to the forest with her father. She would listen, enraptured, as he told her how the forest was so dense it was like a shield, impenetrable to their enemies. He would tell her how he and the other warriors knew the forest better than they knew the lines of their own palms. And this was good. Following the lines of a palm would lead nowhere, But the forest led to the warriors, to other villages that they could conquer to build up their strength. When you are old enough, Essie, you will learn how to climb these trees with nothing but your bare hands, he said to her as they walked back to the village one day. Essie looked up. The tops of the trees looked as though they were brushing the sky, and Essie wondered why leaves were green instead of blue. When Essie was 7 years old, her father won the battle that would earn him the name Big Man. There had been rumors that in a village just north of theirs, warriors had come back with splendors of gold and women. They had even raided the British storehouse, earning gunpowder and muskets in the process. Chief Nuro, the leader of Essie's village, called a meeting of all the able-bodied men. "Have you heard the news?" he asked them, and they grunted, slammed their staffs against the hard earth, and cried out, "The swine of the northern village are walking about like kings. All around Ashanti people will say, it is the northerners who stole guns from the British. It is the northerners who are the most powerful warriors in all of the Gold Coast." The men stomped their feet and shook their heads. "Will we allow this?" the chief asked. "No," they cried. Kwaku Agye, the most sensible among them, hushed their cries and said, "Listen to us. We may go to fight the northerners, but what have we? No guns, no gunpowder, and what will we gain? So many people will praise our enemies in the north, but will they not still praise us as well? We have been the strongest village for decades. No one has been able to break through the forest and challenge us. So will you have us wait until the northern snake slithers its way into our fields and steals our women?" Essie's father asked. The two men stood on opposite sides of the room, and all the other men stood between them, turning their heads from one to the other in order to see which gift would win, wisdom or strength. "I only say, let us not be too hasty, lest we appear weak in the process." "But who is weak?" Essie's father asked. He pointed to Nana Ade, then Kojo Nyarko, then Kwabena Gimma. "Who among us is weak? You? Or maybe you?" The men shook their heads one by one, and soon they were all shaking their entire bodies into a rallying cry that could be heard throughout the village. From the compound where Essie stood helping her mother fry plantains, she heard them and dropped 2 slices of plantains so quickly that oil jumped up and splashed her mother's leg. "Aye!" her mother cried out, wiping the oil away with her hands and blowing on the burn. "Stupid girl, when will you learn to be careful around fire?" Mame asked. Essie had heard her mother say this or something like it many times before. Mame was terrified of fire. "Be careful of fire. Know when to use it and when to stay cold," she would often say. "It was an accident," Essie snapped. She wanted to be outside, catching more of the warriors' discussion. Her mother reached over and yanked her ear. "Who are you talking to that way?" she hissed. "Think before you act. Think before you speak." Essie apologized to her mother, and Mame, who had never been able to stay mad at Essie for longer than a few seconds, kissed the top of her head as the men's cries grew louder and louder. Everyone in the village knew the story. Essie had her father tell it to her every night for a whole month. She would lie with her head in his lap, listening as he spoke of how the men stole out for the northern village on the evening of the rallying cry. Their plan was thin: overtake the town and steal whatever had been stolen. Essie's father told her of how he led the group through the forest until they came upon the circle of warriors protecting the newly acquired goods. Her father and his warriors hid in the trees. Their feet moved with the lightness of leaves on the forest ground. When they came upon the warriors of the northern village, they fought bravely, but it was of no use. Essie's father and many others were captured and packed into huts that had been converted into a prison camp. It was Kwaku Agye and his few followers who had had the foresight to wait in the forest until after the eager warriors had rushed in. They found the guns that the northerners were hiding and loaded them quickly and quietly before moving in to where their fellow men were being held captive. Though there were only a few of them, Kwaku Agye and his men were able to hold off the warriors with the stories they told of the many men they had waiting behind them. Kwaku Agye said that if this mission failed, there would be one raid every night until the end of time. If it isn't the West, it will be the whites, he reasoned, darkness glinting from the gap between his front teeth. The Northerners felt they had no choice but to give in. They released Essie's father and the others, who parted with 5 of the stolen guns. The men returned to their village in silence, Essie's father consumed by his embarrassment. When they reached the edge of their village, he stopped Kwaku Agye, got down on both of his knees, and bowed his head before him. I am sorry, my brother. I will never again rush into a fight when it is possible to reason. It takes a big man to admit his folly, Kwaku Agye said, and they all continued into the village, the contrite and newly christened big man leading the way. This was the big man who returned to Essie, the one she knew as she grew older, slow to anger, rational, and still the strongest and bravest warrior of them all. By the time Essie turned 12, their small village had won more than 55 wars under Big Man's leadership. The spoils of these wars could be seen as the warriors carried them back, shimmering gold and colorful textiles in large tan sacks, captives in iron cages. It was the prisoners that fascinated Essie the most, for after each capture they would be put on display in the center of the village square. Anyone could walk by and stare at them, mostly young, virile warriors, though sometimes women and their children. Some of these prisoners would be taken by the villagers as slaves, houseboys and housegirls, cooks and cleaners, but soon there would be too many to keep and the overflow would have to be dealt with. Mama, what happens to all the prisoners after they leave here? Essie asked Mame as they passed by the square one afternoon, a roped goat, their dinner, trailing behind them. That's boys' talk, Essie. You don't need to think about it, her mother replied, shifting her eyes. For as long as Essie could remember, and perhaps even before, Mame had refused to choose her own housegirl or houseboy from among the prisoners, who were paraded through the village each month, but because there were now so many prisoners, Big Man had started to insist. A house girl could help you with the cooking, he said. Essie helps me with my cooking, but Essie is my daughter, not some common girl to be ordered around. Essie smiled. She loved her mother, but she knew how lucky Mame was to have gotten a husband like Big Man when she had no family, no background to speak of. Big Man had saved Mame somehow. From what wretchedness, Essie did not know. She knew only that her mother would do almost anything for her father. All right, she said. Essie and I will choose a girl tomorrow. And so they chose a girl and decided to call her Abranoma, Little Dove. The girl had the darkest skin Essie had ever seen. She kept her eyes low, and though her Twi was passable, she rarely spoke it. She didn't know her age, but Essie guessed Abranoma was not much older than she was. At first, Abranoma was horrible at the chores. She spilled oil. She didn't sweep under things. She didn't have good stories for the children. She's useless, Mame said to Big Man. We have to take her back. They were all outside, basking under the warm midday sun. Big Man tilted his head back and let out a laugh that rumbled like thunder in the rainy season. Take her back where? Odo. There's only one way to train a slave. He turned to Essie, who was trying to climb a palm tree the way she'd seen the other kids do it, but her arms were too small to reach around. Essie, go and get me my switch. The switch in question was made from 2 reeds tied together. It was older than Essie's paternal grandfather, having been passed down from generation to generation. Big Man had never beaten Essie with it, but she had seen him beat his sons. She'd heard the way it whistled when it snapped back off of flesh. Essie moved to enter the compound, but Mame stopped her. No, she said. Big Man raised his hand to his wife, anger flashing quickly through his eyes, like steam from cold water hitting a hot pan. No. Mame stammered, I just think that I should be the one to do it. Big Man lowered his hand. He stared at her carefully for a while longer, and Essie tried to read the look that passed between them. So be it, Big Man said, but tomorrow I will bring her out here. She will carry water from this yard to that tree there, and if even so much as a drop falls, then I will take care of it. Do you hear me? Mame nodded, and Big Man shook his head. He had always told anyone who would listen that he had spoiled his third wife, seduced by her beautiful face and softened by her sad eyes. Mame and Essie went into their hut and found Abranoma curled up on a bamboo cot, living up to her name of a little bird. Mame woke her and had her stand before them. She pulled out a switch that Big Man had given her, a switch she had never used. She then looked at Essie with tears in her eyes. Please, leave us. Essie left the hut and for minutes after could hear the sound of the switch and the harmonizing pitch of two separate cries. The next day, Big Man called everyone in his compound out to see if Abranoma could carry a bucket of water on her head from the yard to the tree without spilling a drop. Essie and her whole family, her 4 stepmothers and 9 half-siblings, scattered around their large yard, waiting for the girl to first fetch water from the stream into a large black bucket. From there, Big Man had her stand before all of them and bow before starting the journey to the tree. He would walk beside her to be certain there was no error. Essie could see Little Dove shaking as she lifted the bucket onto her head. Mame clutched Essie against her chest and smiled at the girl when she bowed at them. But the look Abranoma returned was fearful and then vacant. When the bucket touched her head, the family began to jeer. She'll never make it, Amma, Big Man's first wife, said. Watch, she'll spill it all and drown herself in the process, Kojo, the eldest son, said. Little Dove took her first step, and Essie let out the breath she had been holding. She herself had never been able to carry so much as a single plank of wood on her head, but she had watched her mother carry a perfectly round coconut without it ever rolling off, steady as a second head. Where did you learn to do that? Essie had asked Mame then, and the woman replied, You can learn anything when you have to learn it. You could learn to fly if it meant you would live another day. Abranoma steadied her legs and kept walking, her head facing forward. Big Man walked beside her, whispering insults in her ear. She reached the tree at the forest's edge and pivoted, making her way back to the audience that awaited her. By the time she got close enough that Essie could make out her features again, there was sweat dripping off the ledge of her nose, and her eyes were brimming with tears. Even the bucket on her head seemed to be crying, condensation working its way down the outside of it. And she lifted the bucket off of her head. She started to smile triumphantly. Maybe it was a small gust of wind, maybe an insect looking for a bath, or maybe the dove's hand slipped. But before the bucket reached the ground, 2 drops sloshed out. Essie looked at Mame, who had turned her sad, pleading eyes to Big Man. But by that point, the rest of the family was already shouting for punishment. Kojo began to lead them into a song. The dove has failed. Oh, what to do? Make her to suffer, or you'll fail too. Big Man reached for his switch, and soon the song gained its accompaniment. The percussion of reed to flesh, the woodwind of reed to air. This time, Abranoma did not cry. If he didn't beat her, everyone would think he was weak, Essie said. After the event, Mame had been inconsolable, crying to Essie that Big Man should not have beaten Little Dove for so small a mistake. Essie was licking soup off of her fingers, her lips stained orange. Her mother had taken Abranoma into their hut and made a salve for her wounds, and now the girl lay on a cot sleeping. Weak, eh? Mame said. She glared at her daughter with malice that Essie had never before seen. Yes, Essie whispered. That I should live to hear my own daughter speak like this. You want to know what weakness is? Weakness is treating someone as though they belong to you. Strength is knowing that everyone belongs to themselves. Essie was hurt. She had only said what anyone else in her village would have said, and for this, Mame had yelled at her. Essie wanted to cry, to hug her mother, something, but Mame left the room then to finish the chores that Abranoma could not perform that night. Just as she left, Little Dove began to stir. Essie fetched her water and helped tilt her head back so that she could drink it. The wounds on her back were still fresh, and the salve that Mame had made stank of the forest. Essie wiped the corners of Abranoma's lips with her fingers, but the girl pushed her away. "Leave me," she said. I'm sorry for what happened. He is a good man." Abranoma spit onto the clay in front of her. "Your father is big man, eh?" she asked, and Essie nodded, proud despite what she had just seen her father do. The dove let out a mirthless laugh. "My father too is a big man, and now look at what I am. Look at what your mother was." "What my mother was?" Little Dove's eyes shot toward Essie. "You don't know?" Essie, who had not spent more than an hour away from her mother's sight in her life, couldn't imagine any secrets. She knew the feel of her and the smell of her. She knew how many colors were in her irises, and she knew each crooked tooth. Essie looked at Abranoma, but Abranoma shook her head and continued her laugh. "Your mother was once a slave for a Fanti family. She was raped by her master because he too was a big man, and big men can do what they please, lest they appear weak, eh?" Essie looked away, and Abranoma continued in a whisper, "You are not your mother's first daughter. There was one before you. And in my village, we have a saying about separated sisters. They are like a woman and her reflection, doomed to stay on opposite sides of the pond." Essie wanted to hear more, but there was no time to ask the dove. Mame came back into the room and saw the two girls sitting beside each other. "Essie, come here and let Abranoma sleep. Tomorrow you will wake up early and help me clean." Essie left Abranoma to her rest. She looked at her mother, the way her shoulders always seemed to droop, the way her eyes were always shifting. Suddenly, Essie was filled with a horrible shame. She remembered the first time she'd seen an elder spit on the captives in the town square. The man had said, "Northerners, they are not even people. They are the dirt that begs for spit." Essie was 5 years old then. His words had felt like a lesson, and the next time she passed, she timidly gathered her own spit and launched it at a little boy who stood huddled with his mother. The boy had cried out, speaking a language that Essie didn't understand, and Essie had felt bad, not for having spit, but for knowing how angry her mother would have been to see her do it. Now all Essie could picture was her own mother behind the dull metal of the cages, her own mother huddled with a sister she would never know. In the months that followed, Essie tried to befriend Abranoma. Her heart had started to ache for the little bird who had now perfected her role as house girl. Since the beating, no crumb was dropped, no water spilled. In the evenings after Abranoma's work was done, Essie would try to coax more information from her about her mother's past. "I don't know any more," Abranoma said, taking the bundle of palm branches to sweep the floor, or straining used oil through leaves. "Don't worry me," she screamed, once she'd reached the height of her annoyance. Still, Essie tried to make amends. "What can I do?" she asked. "What can I do?" After weeks of asking, Essie finally received an answer. "Send word to my father," Abranoma said. "Tell him where I am. Tell him where I am and that there will be no bad blood between us." That night, Essie couldn't sleep. She wanted to make peace with Abranoma, but if her father knew what she had been asked to do, surely there would be war in her hut. She could hear her father now, yelling at Mame, telling her that she was raising Essie to be a small woman, weak. On the floor of her hut, Essie turned and turned and turned, until finally her mother hushed her. "Please," Mame said, "I'm tired." and all Essie could see behind her closed eyelids was her mother as house girl. Essie decided then that she would send the message. Early the next morning, she went to the messenger man who lived on the edge of the village. He listened to her words and the words of others before setting out into the forest every week. Those words would be carried from village to village, messenger man to messenger man. Who knew if Essie's message would ever reach Abranoma's father? It could be dropped or forgotten, altered or lost, but at the very least, Essie could say that she had done it. When she got back, Abranoma was the only person yet awake. Essie told her what she had done that morning, and the girl clapped her hands together and then gathered Essie into her small arms, squeezing until Essie's breath caught. All is forgotten? Essie asked once the dove had released her. Everything is equal, Abranoma said, and relief rushed through Essie's body like blood. It filled her to the brim and left her fingers shaking. She hugged Abranoma back, and as the girl's body relaxed in her arms, Essie let herself imagine that the body she was hugging was her sister's. Months went by, and little Dove grew excited. In the evening, she could be found pacing the grounds and muttering to herself before sleep, my father's coming." Big Man heard her mutterings and told everyone to beware of her, for she might be a witch. Essie would watch her carefully for signs, but every day it was the same thing. My father is coming, I know it, he is coming. Finally, Big Man promised to slap the words out of the dove if she continued, and so she stopped, and the family soon forgot. Everyone went along as usual. Essie's village had never been challenged in Essie's lifetime. All fighting was done away from home. Big Man and the other warriors would go into nearby villages, pillaging the land, sometimes setting the grass on fire so that people from 3 villages over could see the smoke and know the warriors had come. But this time, things were different. It began while the family was sleeping. It was Big Man's night in Mame's hut, so Essie had to sleep on the ground in the corner. When she heard the soft moaning, the quickened breath, she turned to face the wall of the hut. Once, just once, she had watched them where they lay, the darkness helping to cover her curiosity. Her father was hovering over her mother's body, moving softly at first, and then with more force. She couldn't see much, but it was the sounds that had interested her, the sounds her parents made together, sounds that walked a thin line between pleasure and pain. Essie both wanted and was afraid to want, so she never watched again. That night, once everyone in the hut had fallen asleep, the call went out. Everyone in the village had grown up knowing what each sound signified. 2 long moans meant the enemy was miles off yet. 3 quick shouts meant they were upon them. Hearing the three, Big Man jumped from the bed and grabbed the machete he stored under each of his wives' cots. "You take Essie and go into the woods," he screamed at Mame, before running from the hut with little time to cover his nakedness. Essie did what her father had taught her, grabbing the small knife that her mother used to slice plantains and tucking it into the cloth of her skirt. Mame sat at the edge of her cot. "Come on," Essie said, but her mother didn't move. Essie rushed to the bed and shook her, but she still didn't move. "I can't do it again," she whispered. "Do what again?" Essie asked, but she was hardly listening. Adrenaline was coursing through her so urgently that her hands trembled. Was this because of the message she had sent? "I can't do it again," her mother whispered. "No more woods, no more fire." She was rocking back and forth and cradling the fat flap of her stomach in her arms as though it were a child. Abranoma came in from the slave quarters, her laugh echoing through the hut. "My father is here," she said, dancing this way and that. "I told you he would come to find me, and he has come." The girl scurried away, and Essie didn't know what would become of her. Outside, people were screaming and running. Children were crying. Essie's mother grabbed Essie's hand and dropped something into it. It was a black stone, glimmering with gold, smooth, as if it had been scrubbed carefully for years to preserve its perfect surface. "I have been keeping this for you," Mame said. "I wanted to give it to you on your wedding day. I left one like this for your sister. I left it with Baba after I set the fire." "My sister?" Essie asked, so what Abranoma said was true. Mame babbled nonsense words she had never spoken before. Sister, Baba, fire. Sister, Baba, fire. Essie wanted to ask more questions, but the noise outside was growing louder, and her mother's eyes were growing blank, emptying somehow of something. Essie stared at her mother then, and it was as though she were seeing her for the first time. Mame was not a whole woman. There were large swaths of her spirit missing, and no matter how much she loved Essie, and no matter how much Essie loved her, they both knew in that moment that love could never return what Mame had lost. And Essie knew too that her mother would die rather than run into the woods ever again, die before capture, die even if it meant that in her dying, Essie would inherit that unspeakable sense of loss, learn what it meant to be unwhole. "You go," Mame said as Essie tugged at her arms, tried to move her legs. "Go," she repeated. Essie stopped and tucked the black stone into her wrapper. She hugged her mother, took the knife from her skirt, put it in her mother's hand, and ran. She reached the woods quickly and found a palm tree that her arms could manage. She had been practicing, not knowing that it was for this. She wrapped her arms around the trunk, hugging it while using her legs to push her up as far as she could go. The moon was full, as large as the rock of terror that was sitting in Essie's gut. What had she ever known of terror? Time passed and passed. Essie felt like her arms were encircling fire instead of the tree, so badly were they burning. The dark shadows of the leaves on the ground had started to look menacing. Soon the sound of screaming people falling from the trees like plucked fruit could be heard all around her. And then a warrior was at the bottom of her tree. His language was unfamiliar, but she knew enough to know what came next. He threw a rock at her, then another, then another. The fourth rock slammed into her side, but still she held on. The fifth hit the lattice of her clasped fingers. Her arms came undone, and she fell to the ground. She was tied to others. How many, she didn't know. She didn't see anyone from her compound, not her stepmothers or half-siblings, not her mother. The rope around her wrists held her palms out in supplication. Essie studied the lines on those palms. They led nowhere. She had never felt so hopeless in her life. Everyone walked. Essie had walked for miles with her father before, and so she thought that she could take it. And indeed, the first few days were not so bad, but by the 10th, the calluses on Essie's feet split open and blood seeped out, painting the leaves she left behind. Ahead of her, the bloody leaves of others. So many were crying that it was difficult to hear when the warriors spoke, but she wouldn't have understood them anyway. When she could, she checked to see if the stone her mother had given her was still safely tucked in her wrapper. She didn't know how long they would be allowed to keep their clothes. The leaves on the forest ground were so damp with blood and sweat and dew that a child in front of Essie slipped on them. One of the warriors caught him, helped him to stand up, and the little boy thanked him. "Why should he thank him? They're going to eat us all," the woman behind Essie said. Essie had to strain to hear through the haze of tears and buzz of insects that surrounded them. "Who will eat us?" Essie asked. "The white men. That is what my sister says. She says the white men buy us from these soldiers, and then they cook us up like goats in soup." "No!" Essie cried, and one of the soldiers were quick to run up to her and poke her side with a stick. Once he left, her flank throbbing, Essie pictured the goats that walked freely around her village. Then she pictured herself capturing one, the way she roped its legs and laid its body down, the way she slit its neck. Was this how the white men would kill her? She shuddered. "What's your name?" Essie asked. "They call me Tansy. They call me Essie." And like that, the two became friends. They walked all day. The sores on Essie's feet had no time to heal, so soon were they reopened. At times, the warriors would leave them tied to trees in the forest so that they could go ahead and survey the people of new villages. At times, more people from those villages would be taken and added to the rest of them. The rope around Essie's wrists had started to burn, a strange burn like nothing she had ever felt before, like cool fire, the scratch of salty wind. And soon the smell of that wind greeted Essie's nose, and she knew from stories she had heard that they were nearing Fantiland. The traders slapped their legs with sticks, making them move faster. For almost half of that week, they walked both day and night. The ones who couldn't keep up were beaten with the sticks until suddenly, like magic, they could. Finally, once Essie's own legs had started to buckle, they reached the edge of some Fanti village. They were all packed into a dark and damp cellar, and Essie had time to count the group, 35. 35 people held together by rope. They had time to sleep, and when they awoke, they were given food, a strange porridge that Essie had never eaten before. She didn't like the taste of it, but she could sense that there would be nothing else for a long while. Soon, men came into the room. Some were the warriors that Essie had seen before, but others were new. "So these are the slaves you have brought us?" one of the men said in Fanti. It had been a long while since Essie had heard anyone speak that dialect, but she could understand him clearly. "Let us out!" The others tied to Essie began to shout. Now that they had an ear that could listen, Fanti and Ashanti, fellow Akans, two peoples, two branches split from the same tree. "Let us out!" they shouted, until their voices grew hoarse from the words. Nothing but silence greeted them. "Chief Abiku," another said, "we should not be doing this. Our Ashanti allies will be furious if they know we have worked with their enemies." The one called Chief threw up his hands. "Today their enemies pay more, Fifi," he said. "Tomorrow, if they pay more, we will work with them too. This is how you build a village. Do you understand?" Essie watched the one called Fifi. He was young for a warrior, but already she could tell that one day he would be a big man too. He shook his head, but didn't speak again. He went out of the cellar and brought back more men. They were white men, the first Essie had ever seen. She could not match their skin to any tree or nut or mud or clay that she had ever encountered. "These people do not come from nature," she said. "I told you, they have come to eat us," Tansy replied. The white men approached them. "Stand up," the chief shouted, and they all stood. The chief turned to one of the white men. "See, Governor James," he said in fast Fanti, so fast Essie could hardly understand him, and wondered how this white man could. "The Ashanti are very strong. You may check them for yourselves." The men started to undress the ones who still had clothes on, checking them. For what? Essie didn't know. She remembered the stone tucked in her cloth wrapper, and when the one called Fifi reached her to undo the knot she had tied at the top of it, she launched a long, full stream of spit into his face. He did not cry like the boy captive she had spit on in her own village square. He did not whimper or cower or seek comfort. He simply wiped his face, never taking his eyes off her. The chief came to stand next to him. "What will you do about this, Fifi? Will you let this go unpunished?" the chief asked. He spoke low so that only Essie and Fifi could hear. Then the sound of the smack. It was so loud, it took a moment for Essie to determine whether the pain she felt was on her ear or inside it. She cowered and sank to the ground, covering her face and crying. The smack had popped the stone from her wrapper, and she found it there on the ground. She cried even harder, trying to distract them now. Then she laid her head against the smooth black stone. The coolness of it soothed her face, and when the men had finally turned their backs and left her there, forgetting for a moment to take off her wrapper, Essie took the stone from against her cheek and swallowed it. Now the waist on the dungeon floor was up to Essie's ankles. There had never been so many women in the dungeon before. Essie could hardly breathe, but she moved her shoulders this way and that until she had created some space. The woman beside her had not stopped leaking waste since the last time the soldiers fed them. Essie remembered her first day in the dungeon, when the same thing had been true of her. That day she had found her mother's stone in the river of shit. She had buried it, marking the spot on the wall, so that she would remember when the time came. Shh, 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 Essie cooed to the woman. Shh, shh, shh. She had learned to stop saying that everything would be all right. Before long, the door of the dungeon opened, and a sliver of light peeked through. A couple of soldiers walked in. Something was wrong with these soldiers. There was less order to their movements, less structure. She had seen men drunk from palm wine before, the way their faces flushed and their gestures grew wilder, the way their hands moved as though ready to collect even the very air around them. The soldiers looked around, and the women in the dungeon began to murmur. One of them grabbed a woman on the far end and pushed her against the wall. His hands found her breasts and then began to move down the length of her body, lower and lower still, until the sound that escaped her lips was a scream. The woman in the stack started to hiss then. The hiss said, "Quiet, stupid girl, or they will beat us all." The hiss was high and sharp, the collective cry of 150 women filled with anger and fear. The soldier who had his hands on the woman began to sweat. He shouted back at them all. Their voices hushed to a hum, but did not stop. The murmur vibrated so low, Essie felt as though it were coming from her own stomach. "What are they doing?" they hissed. "What are they doing?" The hissing grew louder, and soon the men were shouting something back at them. The other soldier was still walking around, looking at each woman carefully. When he came upon Essie, he smiled, and for one quick second, she'd confused that act as one of kindness, for it had been so long since she'd seen someone smile. He said something, and then his hands were on her arm. She tried to fight him, but the lack of food and the wounds from the beatings had left her too weak to even collect her saliva and spit at him. He laughed at her attempt and dragged her by the elbow out of the room. As they walked into the light, Essie looked at the scene behind her, all those women hissing and crying. He took her to his quarters above the place where she and the rest of the slaves had been kept. Essie was so unused to light that now it blinded her. She couldn't see where she was being taken. When they got to his quarters, he gestured toward a glass of water, but Essie stood still. He gestured to the whip that sat on his desk. She nodded, took one sip of the water, and watched it slip out of her numb lips. This is a content warning from here on out for sexual assault. So please click off for the end of this. I will let you know when this scene is over. He put her on a folded tarp, spread her legs, and entered her. She screamed, but he placed his hand over her lips, then put his fingers in her mouth. Biting them only seemed to please him, so she stopped. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to listen instead of see, pretending that she was still the little girl in her mother's hut on a night that her father had come in, that she was still looking at the mud walls, wanting to give them privacy, to separate herself, wanting to understand what kept pleasure from turning into pain. When he had finished, he looked horrified, disgusted with her, as though he were the one who had had something taken from him, as though he were the one who had been violated. Suddenly, Essie knew that the soldier had done something that even the other soldiers would find fault with. He looked at her like her body was his shame. Okay, that ends the scene from here. Once night fell and the light receded, leaving only the darkness that Essie had come to know so well, the soldier snuck her out of his quarters. She had finished her crying, but still he shushed her. He wouldn't look at her, only forced her along, down, down, back to the dungeons. When she got there, the murmur had subsided. The women were no longer crying or hissing. There was only silence as the soldier returned her to her spot. Days went on, the cycle repeated, then no food. Essie could do nothing but replay her time in the light. She had not stopped bleeding since that night. A thin trickle of red traveled down her leg, and Essie just watched it. She no longer wanted to talk to Tansy. She no longer wanted to listen to stories. She had been wrong when she'd watched her parents that night as they worked together in her mother's hut. There was no pleasure. The dungeon door opened. A couple of soldiers walked in, and Essie recognized one of them from the cellar in Fontyland. He was tall, and his hair was the color of tree bark after rain. But the color was starting to turn gray. There were many golden buttons along his coat and on the flaps above the shoulders. She thought and thought, trying to push out the cobwebs that had formed in her brain and remember what the chief had called the man, Governor James. He walked through the room, his boots pressing against hands, thighs, hair, his fingers pinching his nose. Following behind him was a younger soldier. The big white man pointed to 20 women, then to Essie. The soldier shouted something, but they didn't understand. He grabbed them by their wrists, dragged them from atop or underneath the bodies of other women, so that they were standing upright. He stood them next to each other in a row, and the governor checked them. He ran his hands over their breasts and between their thighs. The first girl he checked began to cry, and he slapped her swiftly, knocking her body back to the ground. Finally, Governor James came to Essie. He looked at her carefully, then blinked his eyes and shook his head. He looked at her again, and then began checking her body as he had the others. When he ran his hands between her legs, his fingers came back red. He gave her a pitying look, as though he understood, but Essie wondered if he could. He motioned, and before she could think, the other soldier was herding them out of the dungeon. "No, my stone!" Essie shouted, remembering the golden black stone her mother had given her. She flung herself to the ground and started to dig and dig and dig, but then the soldier was lifting her body, and soon all that she could feel instead of dirt in her steadily moving hands was air and more air. They took them out into the light. The scent of ocean water hit her nose. The taste of salt clung to her throat. The soldiers marched them down to an open door that led to sand and water, and they all began to walk out onto it. Before Essie left, the one called Governor looked at her and smiled. It was a kind smile, pitying yet true. But for the rest of her life, Essie would see a smile on a white face and remember the one the soldier gave her before taking her to his quarters. How white men smiling just meant more evil was coming with the next wave.